Welcome back to another episode of Choose Courage Inc., where we help creatives, entrepreneurs, and aspiring corporate escape artists break free from the systems that were never built for them and create businesses where people, creativity, and courage come first. I'm Vivianne Castillo, founder of Choose Courage Inc. Earlier this week, I was able to sit down live with my good friend Rachel Dietkus for a conversation called Leaving Isn't the Hard Part, This Is. And today, I'm bringing you the recording. If you don't know Rachel, she's a licensed social worker who works at the intersection of trauma-informed practice and design. She's a good friend and the one that I text when I need real talk about what's happening inside the UX industry and the impact all of it is having on our nervous system, which is a lot these days. She's also one of the speakers I'm bringing to the walkout in June. And shortly into this episode, you'll hear exactly why. We spend the first part of the conversation really naming the patterns that follow you out of corporate without you realizing you packed them. Then we move into why leaving often feels worse before it feels better, even when it was absolutely the right decision. And by the back half, we were deep in what actual healing from corporate looks like when you strip out the cold blunts, the crystals version. No shade to anyone who's into that. More power to you. And threaded through the whole thing was the really uncomfortable question underneath of all of it. What happened when the hypervigilance you built to survive your last job starts looking like your personality in your new life? And Rachel says something shortly into this that completely rearranges how we think about this work. I won't spoil it, but I'll just say it involves a framework from someone incredible who does deep work around trauma and what trauma looks like when it gets decontextualized, and she applies it directly to what corporate conditioning does to us. And honestly, I'm still sitting with it. I also pull out a C.S. Lewis quote in this one that I've been carrying with me for months. And we spent some real time on the topic of grief, the kind that shows up around day 30 of being free and catches you completely off guard. So if you've ever had that experience or you're about to, this conversation will name what you couldn't. One more thing before we get into this episode, this was recorded live. So when you hear questions weaving in and out, that's the room talking to us, all right? That's the chat that we're responding to. I left most of it in because the questions were so good and I didn't want to edit out the feeling of being in that conversation with everyone. All right, y'all. So grab some water, my lovely dehydrated friends. Grab whatever helps you settle in and let's get into it. My name is Vivianne Castillo, and I'm the founder of Choose Courage Inc. My background is in counseling and human services with a focus on trauma and addiction before I made the career switch into tech and UX. If you don't know me, I'm also the founder of FASCO award-winning Humanity Centered, which I winded down last year, really to make some more room for Choose Courage Inc., where these days, as a business coaching consultant, I spend most of my time working with UX and tech folks who are either deep in corporate and are done, or they've already walked out and they're trying to figure out what comes next. And today I'm joined by someone that I trust deeply, my good friend, Rachel Dietkus. She is a licensed social worker, and she's also one of the speakers of the walkout. And Rachel works at the intersection of trauma-informed practice and design. And she is the person, the go-to person that I'm often chatting with when I'm in need of just real talk about what's happening inside the UX industry and the unique trash fire that it is these days and our nervous system. I want to start with something that I've seen across dozens of conversations with folks after they leave corporate that most people don't expect. I'm going to put the first question in the chat for us to work through. And the question goes, what are the patterns people carry out of corporate without realizing it? Let me give some context before me and Rachel go a little back and forth on this one. I think that a lot of people leaving corporate think that leaving corporate is about freedom, more time, more creativity, more ownership. And that's true on paper and true in many ways. But what I've found for myself personally is that in practice, most people bring a lot of the same invisible operating system with them, and they just change the scenery. And so one of the biggest patterns that I often see is in the struggle, it goes around outsourcing authority. So for example, in corporate, Decisions are often shaped by hierarchy, approval chains, performance reviews, and over time, you just learn to look around before you move. Start to wait for the signals that something is good enough or ready. And when people leave, they say that they want autonomy, but they still hesitate. And what I've noticed is a lot of folks end up looking for a boss that isn't there. And so they're looking then to ask for permission in some other ways. Maybe they're going to put something on LinkedIn and they're like, oh, if this isn't vibing, I don't know if I should do it. Or they delay launches or they over research or they keep tweaking something because no one officially has said this is approved. And that is just probably one of the main things that I often see, but I'm curious, Rachel, especially with, like, your lens as, like, a mental health professional, from your perspective, what are you seeing and what do you find often sticks?
Okay, so I've got a lot of notes on this question and a number of things that are gonna, I hope, resonate with folks who are here, those who are watching the replay. And then also it really I feel like this is a really nice bit as part of what you just said here, Vivian. So I think one of the biggest surprises is that when people often leave a job, you do not leave that conditioning right away. This has been very, very true with my own experiences, especially when I think about some of my experiences over the past 5 years, as opposed to maybe 10 or 15 years ago. A lot of us really we carry out these different patterns that made sense in those previous environments that we might have been in. So some of those that I have seen have been like performance mode. You get really used to being on all the time. And I think too, sounding like really smart or intellectual or sounding like super sharp.
Yeah.
Like this constant seeming like you're capable, managing how you are perceived, seeking permission is another one. Even after you leave, you may still feel like you need someone to constantly validate your choices before you can actually, like, trust yourself. This is something that I've seen. I know you and I have both seen this in the community that's been built through that you have built over time, and I think I mean, I this is something that creeps up for me kind of unexpectedly. Like, I'll have these moments where I'll feel like, "Wow, like, I really just wanna run this thing by someone," when I already know what my decision is, and I it's like I slip into these patterns of just not trusting myself like I know that I should,
Yeah.
you know?
Like questioning your gut. I think corporate does a really good job of making you question your gut.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, all right, is this polished enough? Will so and so appreciate this? And over time, we then just learn to question everything that we
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah. I think another one is so there's a handful of things that I think are worthy of touching on. I think another one is hypervigilance, and we could probably
Mm,
spend the next, what, like 50, 48 minutes just talking about hypervigilance.
yeah, right.
And I'll try not to, like, hone in on this like too much, but I think that it's very easy to become like super attuned to like tone, like feedback, silence, really paying attention to shifts in people's energy, like how maybe an email is worded, or I had had an example of this with a colleague, someone who is just as seasoned as I am, and I thought that I was communicating something like super, super, super clear. And his
Mhm.
response was, it was something like, I was offering to meet with him to continue talking about something that was just part of a larger context of like a heavier like midday conversation. And his response back to me was this you saying that we should meet or that we need to meet? And I'm thinking like, wow, it was actually neither. It was like me offering like to meet if you wanted to meet. And so just
Yeah.
again, like moments of, I'll just say, like emotional intensity can contribute to these types of things. And it can also, like, it really, for me, one thing that I've seen is that we can carry this emotional labor as like a constant like default too. Like I
Yeah.
feel like I am 5 years out, literally almost 5 years out to the day of like, one
Congrats.
of my most like horrendous work experiences of my life. I hope I never have something like more horrendous than that. But 5 years out, I still see these glimpses of it kind of creep up. And I just I just think that these are the types of things that are important to note.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's making me think of 2 other things that I've noticed as well. One that I think especially comes from people, like, people who actually care deeply about people and actually helping others, and
Mm,
that is over accommodating. So, I feel like in corporate, you learn to, right, like, manage stakeholders, navigate personalities, keep things smooth and going, but I have often seen how that turns into overgiving,
mm,
especially when you're on your own. You overdeliver, you undercharge, or you bend your process to keep clients happy if you're on the entrepreneurship route. And while it looks like kindness, it actually slowly erodes your own energy and your business. And I would say, like, another one that I see, and this might be a little uncomfortable to put into the space, is that I think many people are more comfortable being needed than being effective.
mm,
And corporate environments love to reward the person that everyone goes to, right? You become valuable because you hold things together. But especially, I know you and I took the entrepreneurship route when we left, our organizations. But entrepreneurship tends to ask something different. And often it asks you to build systems that don't rely on you. It asks you to let go of being the hero, of fighting to be the hero. And in corporate, you're always fighting to be the hero, to be recognized and to get the carrot from the manager that you hate. And
mm.
so then a lot of people then unknowingly just recreate chaos just so that they can stay central.
You know, a there's a piece of this that I knew that we would touch on, and I wrote out some thoughts that also feel very aligned with some of the things that either I've seen in trauma work and in trauma informed design, but also something that I've a really, really important parallel. So I want to mention this because I'm very curious what your reaction to some of this of what I'm going to share.
I'm nervous
So
now.
so I think something that it's along along these lines of like either being or feeling defective in like these patterns that are just so well worn and might stay with us even after we leave some of these environments. And like you said, we were in these different environments and then we transitioned into, doing our own thing and doing like several different kinds of our own thing. Sometimes people are going from a toxic and very unhealthy like work environment and then they transition to one that is maybe just like slightly less toxic or slightly less unhealthy. I won't even say like healthier. And it can when people go through situations like that and things are maybe not necessarily improving, it can I think there's this internalization of feeling like, okay, well, there must be something wrong with me. Like I must
Mm,
be somewhat like defective. And there's
yeah.
this aspect of defectiveness that I think is that really made me think of something that fellow social worker like Resma Menakem talks about. So if anyone has ever followed or listened to anything that Resma Menakem has shared, especially over the past like several years, I've heard him in many times like talk about this aspect of defectiveness. And I remember there was someone bear with me on this like story for a second. I remember attending one of his webinars or talks, and there was a person who, came on camera and came off mute and asked a question. And while she was asking this question to him, like she was just very visibly kind of like holding onto her heart. And it was just like where her as she was talking, she was sort of like resting her hand like right in this area. And he noticed it and he called attention to it in a way that was I just one of the most powerful things that I've seen. But he said to her, he said, "You are not defective." And you could feel like the emotion in the room. And so there's this parallel that I want to draw to this definition that Resma has often given about trauma. And it's along this aspect of defectiveness and what does it mean when something is decontextualized as part of that like aspect of being defective. So there's this really beautiful cadence that I've heard him say this a number of times. I've seen like hundreds, if not thousands of people like requote him, but he has this cadence of describing what trauma decontextualized looks like. So if you haven't heard this, I'll share this, and then I'm going to share like the parallel of what Vivianne and I are talking about in terms of a very similar thing that's decontextualized. But in the trauma context, he says trauma decontextualized in a person can look like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family traits. And trauma decontextualized in a people looks like culture. Stay with me on this. What often gets decontextualized after people leave work environments like what we are talking about is often adaptation. So hypervigilance starts to look like your personality. Over responsibility starts to look like maybe like your character. Emotional suppression starts to look like professionalism. Permission seeking starts to look like maybe like humility. But when you put it in the context of what we are talking about, both to now and now today, and also like at the walkout, is that many of these are very normal human reactions that have become extremely patterned responses to the system that people were inside. And so I feel like, what you and I have talked about these types of things, either in conversations like this, in person, via text, via audio notes, at the last walkout in January. And it was something that just was becoming like much clearer for me as we were preparing for this today. So I'm kind of curious, have you seen some of the same type of like decontextualization, where let's just say hypervigilance, it actually looks like maybe someone's personality. I mean, I'm curious what this has looked like for you.
Yeah, I think what is coming up for me with this, and then I'll shift us into kind of like our next question, is that, and what I want everyone to hear is that these patterns are a character flaw. In many ways, they're a learned survival response in an environment that often rewarded them or made it feel safer to just go along with the flow. And so being able to name some of these first is like a really important move. It's one of the reasons why I remember I was writing this article for, I forget what publication, but like the article was basically like, what piece of advice would you give your earlier in your career self? And one of the things that I often go back to is, if I were to go back in time and be able to speak to Vivianne fresh out of college, getting into, her career, I'd be like, girl, go to therapy sooner, because these systems will find ways to weaponize that against you, right? So if, I'm coming from a background where, I was essentially like the emotional support animal to like my parent, growing up with a narcissistic parent, like an actual narcissistic parent, not someone who was just mean. And what you learn in those settings is the emotional availability isn't there. So therefore your problems and needs don't matter. And that's convenient in workplace settings, right? Because you'll be less vocal about things. It's easier for you to follow the carrot or the moving goalpost. But I think learning and being able to sit with yourself and start some of the healing, and we're going to get to this question in a little bit, is a huge part of then recognizing what is more of a survival mechanism versus an actual like personality thing, right? And so what I want to do is I want to shift us a little bit into our next question. I think it's a good segue. Why does leaving often feel worse before it feels better? And I remember, so I left corporate to pursue entrepreneurship full time in the spring of 2021. And the first 30 days, I was like, yo, I'm free. I made it. The sky is bluer, food tastes better. But there's something interesting about trauma. A lot of times our minds and our bodies will suppress symptoms, even memories of trauma, until it feels like you're safe enough to process it. So now I warn clients, usually around day 30 is when you start to remember. Start to remember the things that you had to kind of put on the back burner to just survive corporate. Start to remember the ways that you've allowed people to talk to you, to disrespect you, to make you feel like you were less than. And for me, like, I definitely underestimated some of that grief that came when I left corporate. One of my favorite quotes comes from C.S. Lewis, and he says, I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her real name was grief.
Mm.
Ooh, Lord. And sometimes like grief and anger are just two sides of the same coin, and it's hard to differentiate the two. But I would say, from day 30 to 90, I started to really have to work through a lot of grief. I thought it was anger, but it was grief, right? Grief of what you thought this was going to be, what it could be, what it should have been, and yet what it wasn't. And, Rachel, I'm curious, especially with your background of being a licensed social worker, I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about maybe more of that grief specifically. Because I think a lot of folks expect to feel like this never ending low hum of relief when in reality they often encounter grief instead. And then they maybe think, oh, maybe something's wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. So yeah, maybe speak a little bit into what's actually happening there.
Yeah, I think one of the things I want to start off by saying is that there are many ways to have a whole host of reactions and emotions and even different elements of grief and different kinds of grief, especially with experiences like this. I think one of the probably most important things to like note is that I think people often expect leaving to feel like it's going to be like instant relief, like exactly what you just described. Like I remember having like waves of just wow, like I can breathe again, I can live again. And there certainly is some element of relief, but I think what often follows is either feeling a bit like unstable, feeling disorientation, and then feeling, what you just said, these different elements of grief. I know I personally I've experienced like immense amount of grief with a handful of different experiences after leaving. And this is at different points in my career. So there's like a version of this when I was in my 20s and the nonprofit sector. And there was like a different version of this even when I left an environment that was like really, really like tough. But I felt good when I transitioned from that. There's still these aspects of grief of leaving a place, and the grief can come in a lot of different it can come for a lot of different reasons. It might be because of like explicit things that might have happened. It might be because you hope that the experience would maybe be different than what it was. It could be that there was like a version of you that like worked really, really hard to try to make it work in that environment. I
Mhm.
think there can also be grief for the type of like belonging or recognition, the financial stability that you thought that you had
Yeah.
and or that you actually did have. So, I think that it can be difficult for people because they assume that if they're like leaving and that leaving was like the right choice, it should feel good, right? It should feel like
Yeah.
just like a huge relief.
Well,
But
part of the
yeah, I think that there is you talked about, like, grief and anger. I think there's something about, like, relief and grief that are often, like, also arriving together.
Yeah, and I think too, it's like when you leave a relationship, when you leave a job, a community, a version of yourself,
Mm,
you're not just removing something external. You're stepping away from a structure that has been holding parts of you in place, for better, for worse, right?
yep.
And so even if that structure was limiting or painful, it was still familiar. And it gave your nervous system something predictable to organize around. So when you leave, your system doesn't immediately register freedom. More times than not, it can register loss of orientation. And that's why I feel like it can feel worse at first.
Yeah, there's something, this has come up in again, like in the community that you have nurtured and that you foster. There's something that I have noticed is that, there's some clear things that can feel like you might be losing. So you might be losing like a piece of your identity, or if you over associate with work too much, you can feel like you're actually just like losing your identity. There can also be like certainty, community. I mean, often like we're leaving places where like the organization may have been like just awful or dreadful or various scales of that. But there are people there who we like adore and that who we are going to miss like when we leave. But we also so we might be missing a sense of community, routine, like we've talked about, that financial safety net, and then just a familiar way of how we might measure our own value and our worth. And even as much as I want to say, don't let work, be that be that measure of your own value and your worth. I mean, I am someone who has spent many years working very, very hard at a number of different things. And I am proud of so many like aspects of that hard work. And so it can be a very tricky, like slippery slope for those things to just bleed into one another and to
Mhm.
really find that, I think, very clear boundary that I can be proud of my work, but it doesn't need to define every single like aspect of my being and my existence on this planet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and let me go on like a brief tangent before I transition us a little bit because I think this is also bringing up kind of like a quieter layer to this in that leaving exposes truths that staying allowed you to avoid. When you're inside something, you can blame the system, the person, the environment, but when you step out, you are left with yourself, your patterns, your desires, your fears, your standards. This is why I think, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, it was so jarring for folks. In addition to all the trauma, a lot of people had to sit and deal with themselves for the first time in a long time.
Mhm.
And that level of clarity can feel really confronting. It's not just I left them or I left that job. It becomes who am I now? And what do I actually want in light of the short amount of time we have on this side of forever? And that question can be liberating, but it's also not comfortable because you also have to you have to recognize that you have built emotional habits around what you left. So if you were used to inconsistency, your body may still expect this. This plays out in work, in relationships, dating. So take this for what it is. If you were used to over functioning, your system may feel restless without something to fix. So even when you leave something misaligned, even when you leave something that's not nurturing or good for your spirit, your body can crave that familiarity of that pattern. It's weird, but it's just the way the body can work sometimes. And that can create a confusing experience where you miss what you logically know is not good for you. And there's nothing has gone wrong there. I think that's just conditioning unwinding. And so for someone like y'all who are on this call or if you're listening to this recording, if you're someone who is dreaming, you're building, you're wanting to constantly evolve, then there's this added layer because you don't just leave things, you outgrow them.
Mm.
And outgrowing something often comes with a temporary drop in certainty. Like you had mastery or clarity in the old space, even if it was chaotic, even if it was trash, even if it was imperfect. But in the new space, you're back in experimentation. You're back in the meantime, as I often call it. And that can feel like regression when in reality it's expansion. And that's a lot of these like companies and organizations, they don't want you to see it for what it is. It's expansion. When you outgrow something, that's expansion, y'all. And the honest truth is that leaving asks you to tolerate a period where your external life no longer validates your internal decision yet. The results have not caught up, peace is not fully stabilized, the new relationships, rhythms, or opportunities are not fully formed. So you're holding a decision that only you can see the long term wisdom and vision of. And that requires a different kind of confidence, not the loud, visible
Mm.
kind, but the quiet kind that says, okay, this feels disorienting, I'm not loving this, but I still trust myself and my gut in this moment. And I promise you, forever who needs to hear this, it does get better. But not in the linear, like, TV show kind of way. It gets better in subtle shifts. Right? You notice that you're less anxious in moments that used to trigger you. You realize that you have more space to think, to dream, to wonder. You start making decisions that feel more aligned instead of reactive. And you start to meet people who reflect a different version of you back to yourself. And then one day you look at what you left and you feel neutral instead of pulled or torn. And that's usually the real marker. It's not instant relief, it's more of like the absence of longing for what you already knew was not for you. And so I'll wrap up this rant by saying that leaving feels worse before it feels better because you are not just walking away from something, you're walking into a version of your life that has not fully taken shape yet. And that space in between, I feel like is where most of the transformation actually happens. I'm seeing a lot of really good questions, jump into the live Q&A form. So I'm actually going to jump down into our last question so I can leave more space for Rachel and I to spill tea and talk some shop with you. And that is, what does healing from corporate actually look like? I'm curious, Rachel, like, I would love to hear the practical aspect of this. I don't want the like cookie cutter, I want to be clear. Like, when I say healing, I don't mean the Instagram version. I don't mean crystals and cold plunges and 5 a.m. routines. No shade if that's your thing. More power to you. But I want to get a little bit more into the unglamorous, practical, what does a typical day in the life actually look like version of healing? What are some of your thoughts on that?
So I'm just like giggling over what would my Instagram version of this, that I would share, that I would
I'm
just
not on
even.
Instagram in this version. I am off social media. I've quit LinkedIn.
I know. And I'm thinking about, how many, what are the things that you and I have shared,
Yeah, for-
that are just like funny and uplifting. It's how like
yeah.
the Instagram version would look would look pretty funny and sweet and endearing. Okay. So I think healing is, I'm going to give the bottom line up front. I think healing is lifelong with these types of experiences. It will take on many different shapes and sizes. I think it looks a lot less glamorous than people often expect. So that's like that's one piece of it. I think getting into some of the practicalities, and some of this is going to be like reflective of what some of my experiences have been like in more recent years. I think about this, and you mentioned like your first 30 to 90 days. I think that I'm thinking of the first 6 to 12 months, because sometimes we may have an opportunity, why the other, maybe by choice, sometimes not by choice, to have like this space and this distance away from an environment that we are either suddenly or planned or very, unexpectedly away from. So I think in the first like 6 to 12 months, especially, I think healing can look a lot like decompression. It might not be some like, glamorous like reinvention, at least not at first. But I think that like you're not necessarily becoming this like whole new person overnight, but you are like you're imagining what are those possibilities maybe moving forward. I think that you may begin noticing some of those different patterns and being able to see those patterns much more clearly. I still uncover some of like my very unhealthy ways of working and of overworking and overperforming and overfunctioning. I still see those patterns creep up, even as much as just this past week. I think that you also might start to separate what is really, yours and you from various things that you are actually adapting to and now starting to adapt away from. I think that another piece is that you might be learning that rest does not need to be earned through overwork and burnout and collapsing. And I think, something for me is like I started to like experiment with what are these new ways that I can kind of like test different boundaries or new ways of working and new ways of interacting with peers and colleagues, and especially peers and colleagues who I deeply admire and I deeply respect.
Yeah, you actually like.
Yes, I remember, what one explicit example that might be helpful is that when I went from leaving working in higher ed to then like transitioning to doing my own thing. So very much in like a consulting thing, like choosing like, opportunities where I got to choose that how I wanted to work and what I got to work on. And then I had this very unique, rare opportunity to be the first social worker and designer with US Digital Service, working as part of the White House and like getting to do this work remotely. And it dawned on me as I was starting that experience that this was the first time in I don't know how many years prior that I wasn't leading a project, I wasn't supervising a group of people, that I had responsibility, but I didn't have all of the weight of that responsibility on my shoulders. And so when during my even my first week, I remember telling myself, just don't sign up for anything. Don't volunteer. Don't be like the golden child, good student that I am so very good at doing and being. And I'm telling you, Vivian, it felt like I was wearing a shirt that did not fit, like, the entire time that I was there. I could feel myself, like, I was like, "Oh, why am I so uncomfortable being this different version of myself?" And again, like, I had been
Yeah.
practicing, like, independently, like, I had already started social workers who design. I had done, like, one project after another, like, that I just absolutely loved, and I was still, like, working through these, like, these patterns, you know? And again, I think a large part of it is because I went from, in 2021, working in a very large institution that, again, that was not separate, but it could, but might as well have been, you know? I mean, higher ed is, like, heavily funded by corporate interests. So, I mean, of course, like, that influence is going to seep into all of it. But going from, like, that in 2021 to then a year and a half later, taking advantage of this really, like, rare and unique opportunity with US Digital Service and the White House, and being like, "Oh my god," like, the amount of energy that I needed to utilize every single day to resist all of those previous habits and those previous temptations, it would every single day, like, I had to be it wasn't hyper vigilance,
Sure.
it was a hyper awareness that I had to have in that environment in order to assert these new boundaries, you know?
Yeah. And I think like going going back to the question of, okay, what does healing from corporate actually look like? I really like those examples in terms of how it's played out for you, the more clarity that you've been able to receive. And even just there's a level of gentleness we have to extend to ourselves as some of the old ways of working and functioning still
Mhm,
surface, even though they no longer serve us anymore. And for me, like when I'm thinking about this, like I've had to learn that a big part of healing is relearning your own pace. You know, I think corporate trains for speed and output, but
yep,
healing introduces discernment. You begin asking, is this actually important? Instead of how fast can I get this done? And you start to design your days instead of reacting to them, which is like the biggest shift. And that shift alone can feel really disorienting because it requires you to trust yourself more than a system. A really good book that I'll put in the chat is called Buy Back Your Time
mhm,
by, I think it's John Fitch. I don't know. Someone gut check me on that. But the thesis of this book is that you've been really great on your work ethic. Let's work on your rest ethic.
mm,
Gut check me on the title of that book, but I read this book shortly after leaving, going on 2.5 months of short term leave. And I was just learning to breathe again and remind my body that we're safe. And I feel like this book gave me some really good structure and like accountability of how to think about and relate to time and rest in a different and healthier way. There's also, I think, like a relational shift that often happens when you're healing from corporate. You know, you stop over explaining.
mhm,
Stop people pleasing in subtle ways that once felt necessary for survival. You notice where you used to shrink your ideas to fit into rooms. And so healing looks like speaking more directly, even when it feels risky. It looks like choosing alignment over approval. And for those of you who are listening who are interested in terms of leaving corporate for something else, I think that there can be another layer that's introduced into this because you're not just leaving corporate, but you're leaving corporate to potentially build something that reflects your values. That means healing is not passive, it is expressed through what you create. Please check out the book, The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. If you're looking for a jump start of, I just want to reconnect to being creative again, being
mm,
hopeful again. The Creative Act by Rick Rubin will get you there. But again, healing is often, I think, expressed through what you create. It shows up in even how you design your offers so that they don't exhaust you. It shows up in how you structure rest into your company, not as a reward, but as a baseline. For humanity centered, I had these mandatory weeks called rest and resist weeks. 1 week off in the spring, 1 week off in the fall, and 2.5 weeks off in the summer. And we rotated all of our client work a part of it. It was just a part of the deal. There was 1 year where I did 2 months of paid sabbatical for my team, which put us at about 3 months of mandatory PTO for the year, and we beat our revenue goals by 20%. So I'm like, "Okay, healing is not a scarcity." I know that's what corporate wants me to think, but healing is not a scarcity. So let me get into practically some things before I, again, dive into some of the questions that you all have been submitting.
I've
But
got a couple I wanna add too when you're done.
Yeah, okay. And then practically healing looks like a few consistent behaviors over time, at least for me. Creating space before responding instead of reacting immediately. So instead of feeling like I need to respond to that email within like that day, those few hours, I'll sleep on it sometimes for a day or two and respond. It looks like building financial clarity so decisions are not driven by fear. This is something that we're actually going to be getting into the walkout during the walkout in June. We're going to be talking about how do you overcome and handle the trauma of money. It's about choosing clients that are aligned with your energy and not just your skill set. It's about redefining success in ways that include your well being and not just your output. And it's about letting your work be an extension of who you're becoming and not who you had to be. And so, like, slowly, like, something shifts when you're healing. You stop
Mm,
feeling like you are recovering and you start feeling like you're choosing. That's like the biggest there's like a one-liner there. It's that. Like, you stop feeling like you're recovering and you start feeling like you're choosing. You're not having to be so reactive, but you are actually having more autonomy and some power in your life again.
mm. I think there's some I had to make a list of some of these things because I had to really think what are ones that I'm still like actively practicing and really trying to make a where I feel like I have a pattern, but I want it to be a stronger pattern. I think one is really honestly like looking at your finances, and this is one that I think is harder for people to actually acknowledge and talk about. It's one that is very easy to just be fearful of, and I don't know how many times I've heard from people, especially over the past year and a half, where they've said, I can't leave because, and again, it isn't, I don't say that to diminish or to ignore the realities of financial precarity and just like the serious upheaval, especially in design and UX when it comes to employment. I think some others are like building routines that can give you like a sense of steadiness. And for me, like I need to do that. I think of that in terms of like in month cycles, in weekly cycles, and in daily like rhythms. What are those things? And those might shift over time. Those might look like different things for you than they do for me. Find people that you can just be very like real and honest with. Allow yourself, we've talked about grieving, but I think allow yourself to just be like bummed and disappointed and I think angry about whatever, it could be any number of things. Asking for the support that you need, and sometimes you might not even know what that support is. And then I think something else that's also related to that is becoming more comfortable with saying, I don't know, or I can get back to you. Let me think about this. I've mentioned this, I don't know how many times in conversations that Vivianne and I have had over the past few years. I am a marinator. I am someone who needs additional time for processing different things. I used to see that as a defect for I don't know how long. And I've come to just like own that and embrace it as it is just who I am. It is how I want to function in this world. I don't want to constantly feel like I have to perform my competence. Sometimes I need extra time to think about a thing. Related to that is saying no, like saying no sooner, so even if it's, like not delaying that, responding more slowly to things, again, like taking that extra time, not making every decision from some place of like scarcity, like Vivianne mentioned, or from a place of fear. Because fear
Yeah.
can creep up for me really unexpectedly. And I'd be like, oh my God, like, where is this? Again, it can feel like that shirt that doesn't fit quite right. It's like I can wonder, like, where's this coming from? Is it because I'm tired? Is it because I'm hungry? Is it because it's like legit? But like physiologically, I can feel that response bubbling up. So yeah,
Yeah.
oh my God, we could go on
Those
forever. We have so
for
many.
real.
I know we have questions.
Yeah, this could be like a 90-minute thing. I've been trying to like weave in some of your questions into this dialogue. So hopefully like some of those are getting answered. But before we go to Q&A, I do want to make an invitation to everyone in this room. You already know what we name and what we've been naming together for the last 40-ish minutes or so. That leaving doesn't end the patterns. If anything, it can surface them, right? The urgency, the over responsibility, the way, work has been doing heavy lifting on our identities. And none of that disappears just because the job does. And so one of the things that I want to share with you is called the walkout. It's from June 3rd to June 5th. It's a 2.5 day version of what we started today. And it's where we move from naming the patterns to actually building something that doesn't recreate them. That's the secret. And you'll be with a room full of people in the same chapter you're in, Rachel's also one of our speakers. I'm also doing something really unique for this particular event. So if you've done the first one, this one's very different. I'm bringing in an attorney, I'm bringing in my accountant, and I'm bringing in a health insurance specialist. So you can be able to ask the hard questions that are on your mind in terms of leaving corporate and actually choosing you and betting on yourself. And I'm also bringing in 4 other entrepreneurs who have left UX, who have left tech, and who have chosen entrepreneurship and can share a little bit more about their story. Again, I'm not trying to pitch you this conference. It's more of me inviting you into a room where the conversation we just had keeps going with the people and the frameworks that you need to actually move. So if you've been sitting with this for months, this is where sitting can turn into moving. Rachel, before we jump into some of the questions, I'm curious. I know you're speaking at the walkout in June. Maybe just in one brief sentence so we can get into Q&A. I'm curious about what do you hope folks will leave your session with?
And I think what I most want people to leave with is that if this kind of transition that you might be going through, if it feels harder or messier or more disorienting than you expected, then it does not mean that you're doing it wrong. It just means that you are on the path that is right and meant for you right now, and there are others who are going through that as well.
I love it. All right, first question. Let's get into it. What advice do you have for someone who feels misaligned with corporate work, but does not know what to do next? I'll kick us off with this. I'll make it brief. I think one of the things I often remind my clients is clarity comes through action and doing. And in many ways, it's for me, I'm asking myself, how do I prototype what I might want to do in 30 days? For my UX folks on the call, we got to start applying some of our UX things to our life.
Mhm.
Okay. This is the moment. This is where we shine, okay? If you are curious, I did a podcast episode on this. It's episode 23. But if you go to this link here, I actually made a workbook for y'all, how to prototype purpose and clarity in 30 days. Really, the premise of the PDF and the workbook that's sent to you is how do you create micro experiments just to get more clear on what you want and what you need. So clarity comes through action and doing. And I think doing it in small and safe ways is one of the best ways to accomplish that.
That's good. I don't have anything to add. I think we should go to the next question.
All right, I got you. Let me see here. Rachel, I feel like you'll want to take this one. The question is, how can someone in UX research deliver value without being hypervigilant, over accommodating, or taking on too much emotional labor? I'm curious how you would answer this. I have my own rules of when I was in corporate and things that I also give people, but what's your take?
I think I could definitely give a much longer answer to this. I'm going to try to keep it brief.
Yes, keep it brief, my friend. Keep it brief.
I think it's a matter of really starting with some small boundaries that you know that you can adhere to, and then couple that with a peer or a friend who will help you be accountable to that. I really think that that comes with it's a thing that needs absolute practice. And I think you need to start small and you need to build up that muscle to then just keep that strengthened. Because the last thing I want to say or give advice on is, you just need to be resilient or you need to do this or you need to do that. Those words, aside from making fun of them, are never going to come out of my mouth. But yeah, I think it starts with like small practices that where you can practice those boundaries, adhere to those, and do that with someone who you know will hold you accountable in a way that is going to also hold you gently as part of that process.
Yeah, I love that. My mind goes to a couple different answers. I have a friend of a friend who he's like, anytime I start a new job, I the first day write my resignation letter and I print it and I put it in my drawer. And it's a reminder for me that I can leave anytime I want. And I appreciate that practice. And now I tell a lot of my clients like do the same thing because it helps you to start to recognize, all right, when am I getting to this point of over giving, overextending myself for this company and this corporation that doesn't care about me? A piece of advice I often tell folks who are, maybe they're back in corporate or they're thinking about doing a new corporate job to hold them over to the next thing is I encourage folks when you start your new job, give your new job a solid like 65%. I think a lot of times when we do jobs, we go in 150, 200%. We're just trying to like prove ourselves out the gate. And then the bar continues to being raised. You're not compensated fairly. I say start in with a solid 65, 70%. If anything below 70 feels jarring to you, see what the company does with that. And then, be from there, make adjustments in terms of how much you give. Because a lot of times we can just overgive into companies and entities, and then we leave nothing left for ourselves. So this is a little bit of a self-preservation thing that I encourage my clients to do. And for those who are like, I'm already in the thick of it, Viv, I'm in corporate, I'm like on these teams, like all that advice is crap. I hear you. One thing you could also do is I mean, I've done this even within the corporate teams I've been in. Let's do a pre and a post mortem to some of the research things that we have coming up. So a lot of times we do postmortems, but premortems are new. What are the ways that we might want to prevent ourselves from experiencing A, B, or C? How do we want to prevent one, two, and three happening? And kind of creating some guardrails and guidelines before you are already in the thick of it and you're just reflecting the postmortem, how everything went to crap and how exhausted you are.
Mm, 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 mm.
Man. Anything else you want to add to that, Rachel?
I think it's making me think of just there's some really neat organizations around the world that work on organizations that are ending. And so like transitions
Mm,
and like these types of closings of things. And so there's something along these lines that's making me think of what would a good ending look like for you? And what are the things that you would be
yeah,
able to say that you did as part of that good ending? And
I love
and
that.
maybe that's part of that, like, that resignation that you write, like, when you first start a job or, like, identifying what are the specific things that you did that you, like that again, like, that were commitments to yourself, that were not abandoning yourself as part of that work.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And with that, y'all, we're at time. I think there's only 2 or 3 questions I didn't get to, so I will think about how to answer that in a newsletter or a podcast episode. But Rachel, seriously, thank you for just your time, your energy, your generosity. This is the kind of conversation that I feel like doesn't happen enough, and I'm grateful that you made space for it with me today. And as a friendly reminder before you go, the patterns that you are carrying aren't who you are. The survival patterns aren't necessarily who you are. They're what you learned in order to survive. And you're allowed to put them down. You're allowed to take care of yourself. You're allowed to choose courage over comfort. And as always, please drink some water, my lovely dehydrated friends. Have a wonderful weekend. I hope you're able to throw your work laptop into the deepest, darkest hole you can find for a few days. Enjoy time with family and friends, and we'll chat soon. Thank y'all so much for joining us. Thanks for hanging out with us and diving into some of these real and unfiltered conversations. We know your time is valuable, and so we don't take it for granted. If today's episode made you think, if it challenged you, or gave you something new to consider, we'd love for you to hit that follow button on whatever streaming service you're using. That way, you'll never miss an episode when we drop them. And if you want to go even deeper, sign up for our newsletter at choosecourageinc.com, and you'll get updates on new episodes, access to exclusive freebies, and first dibs on coaching opportunities and other resources to help you make bold moves in your life and business. So we appreciate you, we see you, and we're rooting for you. Until next time, keep choosing courage over comfort, and a friendly reminder to drink some water.